Welcome to the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Marcel Bou, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. This is now our 16th podcast. The previous ones were very ably hosted by Anthony Oliver, who interviewed a series of senior regulators, most recently Andrea Sutcliffe, the Chief Executive of the Nursing and Midwifery Council. They're all fascinating and available on our website, so do have a listen. Our podcasts will still interview high-profile people of interest to regulators. In fact, we're hoping soon to have the UK Government Minister for Regulatory Reform, Lord Dominic Johnson, here on this podcast. But we're changing the format of the podcast too, so that we can also have discussions on topics of relevance to regulators today with various guests at one time to provide insight to help your own regulatory practice. I do hope you enjoy today's episode, in which we'll kick off our discussions by talking about regulation overall as a profession. The Institute of Regulation was set up a few years ago in part to create a community of professional regulators and to improve their knowledge of and skills in regulation. But there isn't really a profession of regulators as such, as there is, say, of accountants or doctors, teachers or lawyers. And if someone says to you, "What do you do for a living?" and you say, "I'm a regulator," they may not really understand what that means. Does that matter? Many people who work in regulators don't really consider themselves to be part of a profession either. The civil service doesn't have a regulatory profession. Is that important? And if so, why? To help us through these questions, we have three highly experienced guests, and they may even describe themselves as regulators too. Leonie Milliner is Chief Executive and Registrar of the General Optical Council. She trained as an architect and had a wide-ranging senior career, including as Chief Executive of another regulator, the General Osteopathic Council. She was also a non-executive lay member at two other regulators, Silex, the regulator of legal executives, and the General Pharmaceutical Council Accreditation Panel, and is a lay member of the UK Advisory Panel for Degree Awarding Powers. Welcome, Leonie.
Thank you very much, Marcel.
Michael Hanton is Deputy Chief Regulator at Ofqual, the qualifications regulator, and held a number of senior roles there following a career in local government. Michael is also a non-executive director here at the Institute of Regulation. Good to have you here as well, Michael.
Thanks, Marcel. Great to be with everyone.
Lovely. And a third, Meg Matthews, has a background in organisational development and HR, including in the private sector and the legal sector. And for the last 10 years, Meg has worked in regulation, previously at the Education Inspectorate at Ofsted, and now at the Office for Students, which regulates universities and others. Thanks for joining us too, Meg.
Hi, glad to be here.
Lovely. Now, introductions done. Leon, let's start with you. Before we move on to the specifics of the sector you regulate, what does it mean to you to be a professional?
Thank you, Marcel. So coming back to the question you opened with, how would we describe ourselves? I would, without hesitation, describe myself as a regulator. And I have spent the last 20 years of my career working in a sector that I characterise as the PSRB sector, so the professional, statutory, regulatory body sector, which I think, particularly if you include the learned societies within that grouping, probably employs about 1 million people in the UK economy. So a significant contribution. In terms of my own practice as a regulator, I think two principles underpin my daily practice. And those principles are trust and integrity. And I think they're the values that would underpin the practice of all professionals, whether doctors or dentists, teachers, or indeed regulators. And underpinning that practice is some form of commitment to the public good, to the greater good, the impact that we make through our regulatory practice, supported by this body of knowledge, which I think we'll come on to talk about in a minute.
Brilliant. That's a lot of really great stuff. And given that you're the one on this call who regulates a profession too, in your case, opticians and others in the General Optical Council, from your point of view as a regulator of a profession, does that cohere what you've just said with what you do as a regulator of professionals?
It does cohere. There are many parallels. We regulate two professions at the GOC. So we regulate the optometrist who tests your sight, the clinician in optometry practice. And we also regulate the ophthalmic dispenser, more commonly called the dispensing optician. We're quite unusual as a regulator in that we also regulate optical practices. So we have as part of our scheme of regulation, an interest both in place and people. What's also quite unusual about our Act is that we regulate the sight test. So a particular clinical procedure is specified in regulation, as well as the sale and supply of optical appliances. So whilst there are some parallels, I think, to the practice of regulation, to the practice of eye health care, I think what we're talking about here is more about the people who are engaged in the business of regulation and how we go about making sure that we regulate safely and effectively for that public benefit.
Brilliant. And they're mentioning people. That's a wonderful way in for you, Meg, as an HR professional yourself and as someone who's worked in two regulators. What's your view on what makes a profession, bearing in mind what Leonie's just said?
Yeah, thank you. I was listening with interest to what Leonie was saying there. I think similar to what she said, it's core for me. A profession is about having a shared set of skills and knowledge, and that those can be transported and used across different employers. And the skills of a regulator are varied, but we're united by some common principles. And of course, we have a regulator's code that underpins the way that we work and some of the behaviours that sit behind that. And there are also parallel professions such as legal and policy and, of course, sector-specific knowledge. So it's a profession that's ripe for cross-pollination from other professions and career pathways that sort of intertwine. And I reflect on this question about what does the profession mean every time I run a recruitment campaign and I sit down with a business and I say, tell me a little bit about what this person needs to have. If you want to hire someone into your senior team, what are the skills that sit behind that? And they'll say to me, well, it's regulatory skills. But of course, you have to unpick that to attract people who might be working in a completely different field, but they'll have the right skills. There's very few children who'll say they want to be a regulator at the moment. When they grow up. But there's plenty who say they want to be a lawyer or a farmer or a doctor or a teacher or a pilot, and all of those people would make excellent regulators too. So it's about identifying those commonalities, and that's what's at the core of the profession for me.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we're building a picture of people who can move into regulation from all kinds of backgrounds, but there is something special about regulation too. Michael, you and I have worked in a number of regulatory organisations for a number of years, and I think maybe you would call yourself a regulator like me. So do you think that people more broadly think of regulation as a profession, or if not, how do regulators think about themselves, do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, to say I certainly would think of myself as a regulator quite proudly. I think it's a great badge to wear. But I think compared to some of these other professions that we've just been talking about, doctors, lawyers, I don't think it is as common for people that work in regulators to think of themselves as a regulator, and I think that's a shame. But I wonder if it's because there's sort of three ways maybe that we think of ourselves. So we might think of ourselves about the industry that we regulate. So we might think of ourselves as, in my case, working in the education sector. We might think of ourselves in terms of the kind of specific discipline that we bring to our work as an auditor or as a comms expert or as a policy expert or a data analyst. Or we might think of ourselves as a regulator. So I think there's these kind of three lenses that people might come to that question from. So for me, 10 years working in regulating qualifications, background in strategy and risk management. But actually, I think the overarching title that makes most sense to me is I'm a regulator, because it's that unique blend of all of those different disciplines together into our context that is really at the heart of what we do as regulators. I also think that's what makes it a really fascinating profession, is the number of different disciplines that come together in our work, and also just how how mission driven we are as regulators, and picking up on, I think it was Meg who was saying about the kind of public interest and just how important that is to us as regulators, that we are here to do something that really matters to society and to protect the vulnerable and to step in where markets wouldn't succeed, and all those kind of really important parts of our sense of mission and purpose that I think underpins our view of ourselves as regulators.
Well, that's you're making regulation sound really exciting, Michael, I have to say, and a mix of all of these different skills and disciplines. But if, as you say, regulators tend not to think of themselves as a profession, does that matter, do you think? We've set up the Institute of Regulation partly to boost expertise amongst UK regulators so people can learn from each other, from best practice. But why do you think it might be important for regulation to become formally recognised as a profession?
Yeah, I think it does matter. I think there's a few reasons why. And first of all, Leonie mentioned this, and I think it's hugely important, which is there's something about a profession which is that people think about how you do that profession better. And that academics, practitioners, maybe think tanks, the people in that profession themselves, they have a commitment to progress within their field, and I really think that that's important for us as regulators. We should challenge ourselves on how do we do the business of regulating better. And to be willing to think about that as a conceptual question and as an academic question, as something where there should be evidence and evaluation. So I think that's key. I think the second thing about a profession is that anybody that works in a profession would expect to engage in professional development, and we should too. So it's not just about there being this kind of body of knowledge and good thinking, but then how do I take that and apply that into my work? And I do think there is a status question. I think it is good that we elevate the status of regulation as just such a fascinating career. The way I would describe regulating or regulation as a profession is just that it's intellectually demanding. It really requires engagement in all of those different domains, and it has a real consequence. So I don't think there are many jobs which are so multidisciplinary and have such an impact on real people's lives in society. So if we can ascribe a professional status, I think that's really important and powerful to communicate that better.
Brilliant, thanks. Leonie, as the Chief Executive of a regulator yourself and an employer of staff, would you see benefits of regulation becoming formally a profession?
I would indeed. I would echo Michael's commentary there around developing a community of practice, which at its heart has a commitment to the advancement of the knowledge that sits underneath and underpins that community of practice, that shared endeavour. And I think it's about maintaining, improving and transferring that knowledge, the replicability of that knowledge through and down the workforce to ensure that, we have a sustainable workforce moving forward, committed to those shared aims, to that public good. I think what's really interesting here is to take a historical perspective as well. And Michael, you mentioned, what drives us is often an intellectual engagement with our subject. And we see, over the last sort of 800-900 years of British history, occupations becoming professions, becoming regulated. You look at the guilds, the cordwainers and the chandlers. At the time, those occupations, those professions were economically really important in society. And then the development, the 19th and 20th century of the professions that we recognise now. So there are occupations that become professional, that achieve that status that Michael talked about. And so I think what we need to do is sort of reach back into time and understand that journey from occupation to profession and how we might learn from that so that we as regulators achieve that status as a profession, that we have a knowledge base that we can describe, that we can document, that we can contest within certain boundaries, that we can transfer on to others. The old-fashioned method might have been an apprenticeship or a pupillage, but now, we use the university sector, don't we, to transfer that knowledge onwards, but somehow utilise that skill so that we have an identity as regulators that we can then, deploy for public benefit.
Fantastic. And interesting in that historical context that many regulators, including the organizations that we've worked for, are relatively new creations, maybe 10 years old or 20. There are not so many regulators that date back more than 40 years. So it maybe the time is ripe. Meg, what's your view on all of this? Do you see any challenges to overcome before regulation can truly become a profession?
I think there are certainly challenges. And I think reflecting on the things that Michael and Leonie were saying there's lots in that space of kind of development and understanding what the professional development that's needed if you are a professional regulator. And I guess by virtue of the fact that we are a relatively young profession, if we are a profession yet, we haven't been on that journey yet in the way that some other professions have been through that and identified their kind of job families that sit within that. And I suppose one of the things that occurs to me and kind of personal learning journey that I had was getting to grips with a type of regulation in one regulator, moving to another, thinking I understood the language, and then realizing that, oh no, this is a completely different type of regulation that we're talking about here. And that spectrum from kind of highly interactive inspection-based models through to much more kind of low interaction risk-based models of regulation means that the skill set that regulators use will really vary depending on the model that they're working in. So to successfully establish ourselves as a profession, we need to make sure that we fully understand that range and we're able to explain it. And when practicing regulation, the other piece is around a kind of cultural shift. So particularly if you've joined a profession you've joined from a profession in the regulated sector, you might not think about a career for yourself as a professional regulator. You might still identify with your kind of former career. So I think from my time at Ofsted about lots of incredible, people who had experience in teaching, in children's social care, those sectors, they thought of that very much as their kind of career home. And likewise, now that I'm at the OFS, lots of brilliant academics, lots of researchers thinking of that as their professional home. Whereas actually there is a kind of new space opening up once you move into a regulator to be a professional regulator. And I think regulation has for a time been seen as a kind of end of career option. And of course, there's value in having that sector experience before regulating it. But with people having longer portfolio careers, we're really starting to feel that shift in culture, so that doing regulatory work is both something you can do at any stage in your career, but also is something that's really valuable in increasing your understanding of the sector that you're working in. So I think that culture change in building awareness in the regulatory landscape will help to build that profession. And we're on that journey, but there's more to go, I think.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're all in agreement, about the direction. And you say we're on a journey, and I'm hoping very much that the government's recent consultation on smarter regulation will in part help move things in that direction even further, and perhaps even for the government to recognise that regulation is a profession and perhaps invest in skills and training as well. So just moving on to what other people can do to support regulators and regulation in general. Michael, what could the government do to help make regulation a profession?
Yeah, I think we've mentioned it earlier. I think one of the really important steps would be to recognise regulation as a profession within the civil service. And just to say, I'm very aware that there are lots of very important and very effective regulators that are not part of the civil service. So that wouldn't be a full solution, but I think it would be an important signal. So it would mean that there would be a head of profession within the civil service for regulation. I think it would open up new opportunities to define common ways of practice or to establish curricula for training and for development to create communities of practice within the civil service for regulators. So I certainly think there's a space there. I think the apprenticeship offer, there's room there. So there is already some offering in terms of regulatory compliance through apprenticeships. But I'm confident there could be more there too in the apprenticeship route. As a way for people to train and develop and to start and grow in their career as a regulator. And I guess a final thought really would be, it'd be fantastic if there was some support for executive education too, and really looking at strategic leadership of regulators and a commitment from government to recognise and invest in the strategic leadership of these bodies that have such a massive effect on society and the state as well.
Yeah, obviously, I agree with that. And the Institute of Regulation provides some of that learning opportunity for people already in regulation. But Leonie, Meg, is there anything else that you want to add about the role that the government can play to support regulators?
I think it would be helpful if government could better articulate the benefits of good regulation, smarter regulation, and the cost impacts and the reputational impacts for UK PLC when regulation goes wrong. That leads quite naturally into the assumption that in order to regulate well, we need to attract, retain, motivate a really well-qualified workforce and a workforce that has at its heart a distinctive and broad base of skill from which we can subsequently specialise. Depending on the regulatory sector that particular organisation or body regulates.
Okay. All right. Now, I know also, in addition to the smarter regulation consultation that the government put out, there's been a report recently by the House of Lords thinking maybe about a new committee or a body to support regulatory practice. And there's also experience of other countries. I know New Zealand and Australia particularly have groups of regulators, just like the Institute of Regulation, where they help build communities and improve practice. Michael, if I can just turn to you, because I know that you've done some training with some world experts in regulation. Is there something that we can learn from other people's international experience, you think?
Yeah, 100%, very much so. I would consider myself very fortunate to have connected to some regulatory professionals around the world. And I think the key standout for me is that just as when I talk to a regulator in a completely different industry here in the UK, there's much more in common than is different. The same is true when talking with regulators around the world. And I think that's fascinating and very important. So I was part of a leadership program with about 40 regulators from 16 countries. So from the Middle East, from the US, UK, Ireland, from countries in Africa, and just such a fascinating opportunity to discuss together these key questions of what is good regulatory practice. And I think that's a really, really important question. It's really digging into regulatory practice. What does it look like to do our work well? And I'm a big fan of the idea that there's nothing as practical as good theory, and having some really good regulatory theory in this context. A guy called Malcolm Sparrow, professor in regulation, just really helped to give us some common language. So I'm a big advocate of leaders across regulatory domains coming together to talk in that kind of way. And in fact, I should give just a quick little plug for our first ever leadership level masterclass that the Institute of Regulation is just launching now, exactly to do that, to bring together leaders in regulators to have that kind of combination of academic perspective with practitioner experience.
And Meg, as a HR professional, development professional, I imagine you'd support that.
Absolutely. I think, Michael and I have done some work together before on exploring what the kind of regulatory theory and what the skills are that people need. And that's really key to helping people to develop the skills they're going to need. But the other thing I think that we need to make sure that we factor in is around the kind of range of softer skills that are essential for regulators. So Michael, you mentioned strategic leadership, which I completely support. I think there's definitely something in that space. Regulators tend to be quite small, but have an impact that is far larger than their size. And that's quite a weight to carry when you're kind of running around trying to find the 2 or 3 people in your organization who can support you with doing the thing that you're trying to do. So that strategic leadership piece is really important. But I also discuss on a kind of day-to-day level with regulators about how we balance the ability to have a friendly engagement conversation with a provider in the regulated sector one week, and then the next week having a much firmer enforcement conversation with them. And managing that change of tone is something that, exists in other professions. It's not unique, but it is something that is quite specific in the regulatory profession. And I think it's important that we capture some of those things, because in my experience, generic training on those sorts of things doesn't capture the complexity of the way that regulators work. So aside from the kind of entry level through to an advanced approach, we also need to think about this kind of professional map that covers the range of the regulatory toolkit. Some people might specialise in enforcement. Others, their regulatory work might be much more data-based and desk-based, but there is that kind of generalist skill set that we need to establish so that people are able to develop themselves broadly as regulators and develop that range of the profession. And that will also help us to think about what development people need in the future. One of the pieces of work that we're doing at the OFS at the moment is about trying to identify a skills database for our regulatory colleagues to understand where they're at, and that they can do a bit of a self-assessment in terms of thinking, how am I doing on these different skills that I need to have? Where am I lacking confidence? Where do I need a bit more support? And that can also help us think about how to allocate work in sensible ways, particularly when we're working in such an agile and risk-based model that we do need to move people around at pace.
That's amazing. That sounds really interesting work, Meg. Thanks for sharing that. I'm sure others can benefit. So we've talked about all kinds of different things, about the people, the skills, the curriculum, the training, the knowledge, a little bit about history as well. So Leonie, just thinking about what we all need to do if we want to develop this, some next steps to making regulation a bit more professional, a sense of community. What do you think they should be?
There's something about cohering around that common cause, that ability to limit harm, but also deliver for the public good. I think it's also a really interesting question in what makes a profession in the 21st century. You can reach back and look at those traditional professions, their buildings, their libraries, their publications, the peer review process. And here we have an incredible opportunity to make a profession and perhaps remake some of those professional attributes, tools and markers for what it means to be part of a professional community. And I'm very aware at the GOC that our workforce extends beyond our staff. So there are many people who are engaged in the discharge of our regulatory responsibilities. Our council members, for example, members who sit on our fitness to practice panels. They're all regulators. They all assist us, and they're all part of this community and need to be drawn into that sense of being part of a modern 21st century profession that is cohered around that common cause, that common purpose, and are prepared to practice in the very true sense of that word, to test and explore, play and rehearse with that idea of what it means to regulate.
Fantastic. Well, I won't attempt to summarize the range of comments that you've made. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I hope also that the Institute of Regulation, as a professional body for the sector, can play a role to support people working in regulation and to help professionalise regulation in the UK more generally as well. Obviously, working with many, many others, including policymakers too. But if each of you were to say to those listening to this podcast who are working in regulatory roles, maybe new to the profession or hoping to work for a regulator, what they could do to improve their skills and to become a member of the UK's regulatory profession, what would you advise? Let's start with you, Meg.
I think I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle to the one that I think Leonie and Michael might come from, because I work in a people profession in a regulator. So my professional home is HR and organisational development, but my career is firmly in regulators. So I've got this kind of dual balance, if you like, and much of my role in HR is about making sure that people are following the rules internally. HR is a kind of organisational regulator in that way. But if I was to give advice to someone who wants to develop either as a regulator or in a professional services role in a regulator, which I think is actually quite a distinct thing to do, my top tip would be to understand the work of the regulator and understand the work of the sector. You need to understand the impact of regulation, what it achieves, what the benefits are of that regulation. As Leonie was talking about, it's that kind of values piece. What do we do that is good from doing this work? But we also need to understand the impact of regulation on the sector, a sector that, may be struggling, may be finding things difficult. And we need to think about the impact of the way that we work and work with the sector to make sure that we're doing it in the best way. It's easy to focus on your professional development in your individual field and forget that there is a wider picture of the work of the regulator and the work in the sector. So hold yourself to a high standard, be ready to justify the things that you do, because if there's one thing I've learned from working in regulators, even in a professional services role, it's that your decisions are open to external scrutiny in a way that they aren't in any other employers. So be ready to understand it and be ready to hold yourself to account for the decisions you make.
Very wise advice indeed. Leonie, what would you advise?
We never stop learning. I think wherever you are in an organisation, that appetite to learn, to grow and develop, to understand your sector that you regulate, as Meg has described, but also to understand the business of regulation is paramount in relation to the utilisation of your skills in your role and in the furtherance of your career in this fabulous sector called the PSRB sector.
PSRB, professional, let's just remind ourselves.
Professional, statutory and regulatory bodies.
Excellent, excellent. Michael, what would you advise to somebody listening to this podcast who wants to improve their skills?
I'm going to make 3 suggestions. Number 1, come do the 2-hour free session for members of the Institute of Regulation, an introduction to regulation. So 2 hours. Second suggestion, do our 2-day program. So with Professor Martin Lodge, and a great opportunity to meet people from other regulators and spend 2 days stepping back and thinking about regulation as a profession. And my third suggestion is a little bit different. I'm going to put in a plug or a recommendation for a book. It's called Fundamentals of Regulatory Design. It's a brilliant book. It's really accessible and a great introduction to some of the key concepts in regulation. And some of my colleagues here at Ofqual, they've got a little book club. So they read a chapter. I think it's every fortnight, come together, have a discussion. I think it's a great way to think and develop understanding and an awareness of some of the concepts that underpin our work as regulators.
Great stuff. Right. Last question before we close. I said kind of half jokingly at the beginning that if you say to somebody, I'm a regulator, they will glaze over probably. But so I tend not to do that, except when I'm among regulators. Now, how do you describe your jobs if you're asked? Michael?
Oh gosh. Okay. I have lots of different answers as well. Probably the one that I'm most like is I work for the regulator responsible for looking after the qualifications taken by 1 million children every year.
Good one. Leonie, what do you say?
I say I'm a regulator and I help the nation see.
Oh, that's amazing. Good one. How about you, Meg?
I never know what to say. But I think that in time, what I'd like to be able to say is that my work is about enabling regulation to happen, coming from the position that I come from. And I'd hope that in time, people might understand what I mean by that.
Good stuff. That's amazing. Well, when I was working at IPSA, the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, as soon as I started talking to people about the fact that I regulated MPs, then you can imagine they went off onto all kinds of topics which were not about regulation whatsoever. But let's hope that in time, people do come to see regulation as a profession, because I agree completely that it's just absolutely fascinating and very, very rewarding indeed. So thank you very, very much, all of you, for your contributions. Meg Matthews, Michael Hanton and Leonie Milliner. I'm really, really grateful. And for those of you listening too, thank you for tuning in. I do hope you found the discussion interesting. Do also listen to future podcasts where we'll discuss other issues of interest, including the outcome of the government's Smarter Regulation consultation. I'm hoping we'll get the Minister to talk to us himself. And you're welcome to suggest ideas of your own via the website and info@ioregulation.org. There's lots of other material on the website, a newsletter, online events, and as Michael has mentioned, some training that you're welcome to participate in, as well as special interest groups on specific issues like policy or diversity or enforcement, all on the website, ioregulation.org. So thank you very much for listening to me, Martial Bou, at the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. Good luck with all your regulatory challenges, and do stay in touch with each other and with the Institute so you can learn more and help UK regulation become the best it can. Thanks very much. Goodbye.